Hey, I'm Bob at ILikeToMakeStuff. Today we're gonna make this guy. A few weeks ago, I put out a video about life casting, and that's how Bill Duran and his team from Punished Props made the mold of my head so that we could make this casting. Today we're actually gonna make this cast. And the reason I'm doing this is because eventually I wanna make some prop helmets. And by having an exact copy of your head, you can make templates for those helmets that will fit you perfectly. All right, let's check out how this is done. I wanted to be able to spin around the head casting while I worked on it, so I added a Lazy Susan bearing to 2 scrap pieces of plywood. This is done by centering the bearing on one piece and then marking for the holes and then drilling those holes all the way through that piece. Then you center the bearing on the opposite piece and actually screw it on. But before I screwed those together, I wanted to add something for the head casting to be mounted on. I drilled a couple of holes and then hammered in some giant nails that I had. I bent these over and then faced them out in opposite directions so that the head casting wouldn't just slide off. I added a few more screws, and this just gives the plaster something else to grab onto with the head casting. I lined up the holes from the top of the plywood down into the bearing below and drove in some metal screws to connect it all together. And then it was time to pour the casting. Now this mold was made in a previous video, so go back and watch that if you haven't seen it. I set it in a 5-gallon bucket and tried to reinforce it with some extra wood scraps. I prepared 2 buckets of water and then got out my hydrocal plaster. I'm gonna link to another video that actually explains the entire process for mixing this correctly, but basically you wanna pour it in without agitating it. Once you agitate it, it starts to set up. So I got all the plaster in there before I started stirring it, because then you only have a few minutes of working time. After it was fully mixed, I poured it into the mold. Now I should have only poured part the way up and then reached in to get rid of the air bubbles around the ears and the nose, but I forgot. So I filled it up by accident, then had to reach in and wasted a lot of plaster. Once I got all the bubbles out of there, I went ahead and just filled it up with the rest of the plaster, and it worked out fine. Then I just placed in the Lazy Susan with the nails down into the plaster and let it dry overnight. After I pulled it out, some of the plaster had dripped out of the bottom, and I just had to break that off of the screws that held the mold together. I removed the screws and then just had to pry apart the outer plaster part of the mold. I was really worried that I was going to break this part, so I took my time, but eventually they came loose and I pulled off the 2 plaster pieces, then removed the silicone. The silicone only lasts for a few castings, and I could actually feel it tearing as I pulled it away, so I don't think I'm going to be able to get another one out of this, but this one turned out pretty good. There were still a few air bubbles on the cheeks, and one of the earlobes didn't quite fill up, but overall it was a pretty good casting. Since the mold was open around my nose, there was a fair amount of plaster that leaked out during the process. I scraped all that away with an old chisel. I used that same chisel to even out some of the area between the bald cap and my skin. Now it doesn't really matter what this thing looks like, the details are not important for sizing, but I figured since I was here, I'd go ahead and try to make it look as good as possible. I used some sandpaper and chisels to try to smooth out the areas, but I didn't worry about trying to get the texture between the bald cap and my skin to match up. It just wasn't worthwhile. I used a Dremel with a small ball end bit to clean out the inside of the nose and the ears. This was a lot easier to get in there and clean it out than trying to use a chisel in those areas. I didn't want this to dry out too fast, so I worked on it a little bit one day and then covered it with a plastic bag while it was still a little bit wet. The next day I did some more sanding, but I found that when I had tried to support the mold with the pieces of wood, it actually caused some indentions. I needed to fill those in with something, and I decided to use epoxy Sculpt. This is a 2-part epoxy putty that you mix together with a 1-to-1 ratio, and you can mold it and sculpt it in any way that you want to. This is the same stuff that I used on my Nerf gun a long time ago. I'll link that down in the description. You can use water to help smooth it out and feather it into the surface. I filled in some of the smaller areas, but then had to use quite a bit of this stuff to get the big indention in the top of the head. I just followed the contour of the head and tried to make it look as natural as possible. I also filled in some of the air bubbles on the side of the face so that you wouldn't see them once it was sanded down. The last little bit was to add a transition from the Sculpt down onto the Lazy Susan, and to do this, I just filled in the gap with some air dry clay. While I'm getting that clay packed in there, let me tell you about the sponsor for this video, The Great Courses Plus. It's a subscription on-demand video learning service with over 7,000 video courses. These are taught by professors from Ivy League schools and experts from places like the Smithsonian and National Geographic. They've got all sorts of topics: science, math, history, art, even photography and games. I've been checking out a course recently called Understanding the World's Greatest Structures, and it talks a lot about the physics of how buildings work, but specifically there's one episode about the materials used in buildings. It's cool because it talks about wood all the way to steel and why certain materials are used in certain types of buildings. It's a cool intersection of making stuff and science. If you want to check some of these courses out, you can go to thegreatcoursesplus.com/makestuff and sign up for a 1-month free trial. I'll put a link to that down in the description, so go start your trial today. After everything was fully dry, I went over all of it with a sanding block. This helped me smooth out the transition between the materials and to get rid of some of the unnecessary texture on the face. If the texture was really important, I definitely could have done a couple of more coats of filling and sanding, but I just decided to let it be good enough. I blew off all the dust and then took it to my paint booth just to paint it a solid color. The paint doesn't matter at all, and it will no doubt get messed up once I start using this, but I thought it looked cool. I'm pretty happy with how this thing turned out. There is a little bit of weird shaping back here, and I think that's because the mold was sagging a little bit in one direction, so it kind of looks like my head goes like this. Hopefully that won't be an issue when I'm making the templates for my helmets, but we'll find out. In regards to the paint, there's no real reason to paint this. I just wanted it to be a uniform color so that it looked better on camera, since I had different materials going on. But really that has nothing to do with how well it will work or anything like that. One idea I did have about painting this in the future, which I may still do, is to add chalkboard paint or dry erase paint. And that way you could actually use some chalk or dry erase markers to draw some lines to build out your pattern before you actually start putting things on here. I think that would be a pretty cool thing. I just didn't have time to add either one of those because both of those types of paint take a couple of days to dry. That's it for this one. Keep an eye out for the helmet builds that will be coming up using this in the next couple of months. I've got a lot of other projects and videos that you might be interested in, and don't forget to go back and watch the molding process for this cast in case you haven't. If you want to support these videos that I make, Patreon is the best way to do that, and don't forget to subscribe so you get all the future videos. Thanks for watching, everybody. I'll see you next time.